The water was already moving, not parting, not splitting into walls of green and silver, just moving, the way water always moves, slow and indifferent, and completely unmoved by the 600,000 people standing at its edge with an army closing behind them. That is where this story ends, in most versions of history that do not involve a miracle. Not with triumph, not with a nation born, with mud and reeds and the sound of chariot wheels on dry ground getting closer. What happened next, in the version the world remembers, became the single most repeated political sentence in human history. Iko, a slave people walked through water and came out the other side as something else. A nation, a covenant, a people with a law and a land and a God who had chosen them specifically, personally, out of all the peoples of the earth. That sentence did not come from a theology seminar. It came from a body of water in the eastern delta of Egypt, roughly 1,250 years before the Common Era. On a day when, according to the account that shaped 3 world religions, the sea moved out of the way. Remove that day. Keep everything else exactly as it was. And the world that follows is not slightly different. It is structurally unrecognizable. The first thing that collapses is not a religion. It is a man. Moses, without the crossing, is not a prophet. He is a failed insurrectionist with an implausible origin story, a stutter, and a body count from a murder he committed decades earlier. The Pharaoh's court already knew who he was. His own people had already doubted him twice. Without the sea, the plagues become the last desperate act of a man who ran out of leverage. The army catches them, the escape fails, and the historical record, such as it was, closes over Moses the way the water did not. Failed liberation attempts in the ancient world left almost no trace. The revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC had 70,000 followers and ended with 6,000 crucifixions along the Appian Way. Within 2 generations, it was a footnote. An escaped Hebrew slave leading a group of mixed nationalities through the Sinai, recaptured at the water's edge in 1250 BC, would have left less. What disappears with Moses is not just a man, it is the transmission event. The Torah, as a written and codified text, does not exist yet at the moment of the crossing. It gets written, compiled, and canonized over centuries, but its authority is grounded in that founding moment. The God who split the sea is the same God who gave the law at Sinai. Pull the crossing out, and the chain of authority breaks. The law becomes the document of a community that failed, not of a people God personally delivered. No delivered people, no delivered law. What grows in that absence is not nothing. Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and Greece all had legal traditions, religious texts, cosmologies, origin myths. The ancient world was not empty of meaning-making systems, but none of those systems contained the specific structural idea that the Exodus introduced, which is this: that a God intervenes in history, specifically on behalf of the enslaved against the powerful, and that this intervention is the founding act of a nation's identity. That idea does not exist anywhere else in the ancient world in that form. Roman founding mythology centers on Romulus, a king's descendant who kills his brother and builds an empire. Mesopotamian creation myths center on cosmic battles between gods. Greek founding narratives center on heroes with divine parentage who conquer and settle. Every one of these systems produces the same political theology. Power is legitimate because the powerful are closer to the divine. The Exodus inverts that entirely. In the Exodus structure, power is suspect. The king is the villain. God is on the side of the people with no army, no land, and no leverage. That inversion is not a minor theological quirk. It is the most politically explosive idea in the history of organized religion. And it comes from one specific event, the moment the sea moved and the army did not follow. Without that event, the inversion does not get codified. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all inherit it, but they inherit it from the Exodus. The Quran references Moses more than any other prophet, over 136 times, Because the Exodus is the template for how God acts in history. Paul's letters in the Christian New Testament treat the crossing as the direct prefiguration of baptism and salvation. Every Christian theologian, from Origen to Thomas Aquinas to Martin Luther, built their understanding of divine rescue on that founding template. Remove the template, and all three traditions have to rebuild their theological grammar from scratch. Without the word liberation at the center, the names are where the loss becomes specific. In the spring of 1863, Harriet Tubman led the Combahee River Raid into South Carolina, freeing over 700 enslaved people in a single night. She had already led 13 missions on the Underground Railroad, and the people she guided to freedom called her Moses. Not metaphorically, as a formal title, because the framework for understanding what she was doing, a deliverer, a crossing, a people walking out of bondage into something new, only existed because of a night in Egypt, roughly 3,100 years earlier. On the evening of April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood in Memphis, Tennessee, the night before he was assassinated, and said, "I've been to the mountaintop. I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land." The entire structure of that speech, its comfort, its defiance, its ability to make his own death feel like Moses dying within sight of Canaan rather than a murder in a parking lot, is Exodus grammar. Without the crossing, King has no mountain. He has only a balcony. Nelson Mandela's African National Congress used the language of Exodus throughout the decades of imprisonment and resistance. The spirituals that sustained enslaved Africans in America for 2.5 centuries, plus songs like Go Down Moses and Deep River and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, are all structured around the same template. There is a promised land. There is a crossing. There is a God who sees. None of that language exists in a world where the army caught them at the water. In that world, there is no Moses to call Harriet Tubman. There is no mountaintop to promise Martin Luther King. The people who would have reached for that language are still reaching for something, Gadah. But the specific word, liberation, deliverance, the crossing, is not there. And language is not decorative. The words people use to name their suffering shape what they believe is possible on the other side of it. This is where a comparison becomes essential, because the argument is not that humans would never have imagined freedom without Moses. The argument is that no other ancient founding narrative produced a reusable, exportable grammar of liberation that could be picked up by radically different communities across 30 centuries and still fit. The Exodus narrative is uniquely portable because its protagonist is not a warrior, a king, or a demigod. Moses is an orphan who grew up in the wrong house, who killed a man, who spent decades in exile, who argued with God 3 times before agreeing to go back. He wins nothing through strength. The sea moves because God moves it. And that structure, God acting on behalf of the structurally powerless, turns out to be the one political religious idea that translates across every culture that has ever produced an enslaved or colonized population. The Roman founding myth cannot do that. Romulus cannot be picked up by an enslaved person and used as a mirror. Moses can be. Moses has been in cultures that had never read the Torah because the story traveled through Christianity and Islam and became the shared inheritance of 3.5 billion people. In the world where the water stayed still, that portability is gone. Movements still form. People still resist, but they resist without a template that has already proven across 3 millennia that a people with no army and no leverage can walk through the worst thing that has ever happened to them and come out the other side as something else. The water on that shore in the eastern delta was cold in the early morning. Reeds, mud, the smell of salt and low tide. Behind them, the sound of Pharaoh's chariots. Ahead, nothing but open water and the far shore that was too distant to swim. In the world we did not get, the water moved. In this one, it did not. And every speech that has ever begun with the words, "Let my people go," every hymn sung in a language its singers were forbidden to write down, every prisoner who has ever scratched Exodus on a wall, every constitution that has ever declared human dignity inalienable and meant it, All of it runs back to that single morning. To a shore that no army crossed, to a people who walked out the other side, to a word, liberation, that may be the most politically dangerous word in the history of human language, because it carries inside it the memory of a day the sea moved and the powerful were stopped dead in their tracks. The day the water stayed still is not a story about Egypt. It is the story of every people who ever needed to believe that crossing was possible. And in this timeline, they never got to believe it.